Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the powers of the state governments. So much of the protection for state authority comes from the 10th Amendment, which reserves the powers not delegated to the national government to the states. So, what the 10th Amendment does is it distinguishes these two governing spheres, so the state governments and the national government. So, reserved powers are the powers that were not given to the national government, so not given to the national government in the Constitution, and are therefore retained by the states. So, these are the powers reserved to the states because they are not given specifically to the national government. So, these are going to include police powers. So, anything pertaining to the health, safety, and welfare of citizens. So, a good example of this would be those COVID-19 restrictions. So, in some states, more restaurants were open than in other states. In some states, you are required to wear a mask in public where you're not in other states. And those restrictions, those mandates go back to those policing powers of states. Okay, so providing for the health, safety, and welfare of citizens. Another example of this would be distracted driving laws. So in Kentucky, texting and driving is illegal. In some states, even talking on the phone or having a phone in your hand is against the law. Okay, so things differ from state to state. States are authorized to conduct elections, and you might say, well, hey, Ms. Collis, there's a federal election commission. How does that work? We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the unit. And states can establish local governments, so your county and city governments. So other powers of state governments. So concurrent powers are granted to both the states and the federal government in the Constitution. So this means that both the federal government and state governments have these powers. So the power to tax, when Ms. Collis gets her paycheck, both federal taxes and state taxes come out. The power to borrow money, the power to pass and enforce laws. So there's federal laws and there's state laws. To operate a system of courts. So again, there's that federal court system and then there's state court systems, and to charter banks. Now, states cannot enter treaties with foreign governments, print money, tax imports or exports, or declare war. Remember, those are powers that are specifically given to the national government. So that means that states do not have those powers. So this is just a visual breakdown of federalism. So you have powers that are delegated to the national government, those expressed or enumerated powers of the Constitution. Then you're going to have those shared or concurrent powers, so powers that are given to both the federal government and the state governments. And then you have those reserved powers, so those powers that are given to the state governments or reserved for the state governments. And this chart just does a good job of breaking down what some of those powers are. So you can see that state governments, they have the power to set up public schools, conduct elections, set up those local governments, establish marriage and divorce laws, so regulating and defining those legal relationships, divorce laws, things of that nature. Then you have those concurrent powers, so both the federal government and the national government can collect taxes, set up those courts, punish lawbreakers. Then you have the expressed powers that are given to the national government in the Constitution, like coining money, declaring war, making treaties. Regional and local governments. So the Constitution does not describe the powers of levels of government below the states. So the authority of the smaller unities is dependent upon and subordinate to the authority of the states. And what this means is that states set rules that local governments must follow. Okay, so what this means is county governments, city governments, they're answering to the state governments. So this means in anything pertaining to public utilities, public school districts. So we in Pulaski County, we are a public school district, so we have to follow any kind of state law, state regulation. So relationships between states. So the full faith and credit clause requires states to recognize the public acts and records and civil court proceedings from another state. So this includes marriage licenses and child support. And this is going to have, this was, I guess is a better way of saying, this was an issue because before the Supreme Court declared any laws prohibiting same-sex marriage as illegal and unconstitutional, because some states would recognize same-sex marriage and other states wouldn't. So we're going to look more specifically at one of those cases later on in this unit. But the full faith and credit clause does require states to recognize those public acts and records and civil court proceedings from other states. But there are limits to this. So for example, Ms. Collis has her driver's license. Obviously, some of you might already have your driver's license. So if you're driving through a state, so say you're traveling to Tennessee or Ohio or just anywhere, your driver's license has to be recognized by that state. You have a driver's license from the state of Kentucky, so your driver's license is recognized in other states. However, if you move to another state, so you have a change of address, say you move to Tennessee, the state of Tennessee could compel you to get a new driver's license from the state of Tennessee. Okay, so there are limits to this full faith and credit clause. So relationships between the states. Extradition is the requirement that officials in one state return a defendant to another state where a crime was committed. So if a person commits a crime in the state of Kentucky and they flee to another state across the country, then that state has to return that defendant to the state of Kentucky where they committed that crime. The Privileges and Immunities Clause prevents states from discriminating against people from out of state. So states have tried to make laws that are providing benefits to residents of their states, and they've struck those laws down. So an example would be Florida cannot charge higher sales tax for tourists at Disney World. So that goes against the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And you might say, well, hey, Ms. Collis, colleges charge in-state and out-of-state tuition. How do they get away with that then? Well, for residents, they have already paid taxes that are going towards supporting those in-state schools, okay? So it is an exemption to this Privileges and Immunities Clause. And that is where we are going to stop with this lesson.